Well, good morning to my online classes, both my full semester and second 8 weeks. I greet you here on March 25th, beautiful Friday morning. We're going to be covering Chapter 10, Campaigns and Elections. We'll have one more chapter dealing with the real intense political aspect of the chapters, which really starts from, say, Chapter 6, going all the way up to Chapter 11. Next week we'll be covering interest groups. For this week then, campaigns and elections, and the way that I look at this chapter in many ways, I will be covering some aspects of other chapters that we have covered, but I think that it's all interconnected, and so some of the material we would have brought up in some other instances. So just be aware of that as we cover this material. For example, the realignment, I think this has been brought up when we talked about political parties, and certainly when you look at the changes from one party system to the next, that's when you have a realignment. The realignment's where a majority party becomes the minority party, and the minority party becomes the majority. In almost all party systems, that was pretty much fairly straightforward. It's something that you could have witnessed in terms of one key election. In our modern party system, perhaps our contemporary party system, that's a little bit harder to define. But for example, the age of the New Deal, the fifth party system, you have in 1932 the election of Franklin Roosevelt, as we see here in this picture, became a time of having one party clearly the dominant party. That's the realignment. But we also have de-alignments, and that's a movement away from the two-party system where you have a significant portion of the electorate that starts to back a candidate that's outside of the two-party system. And clearly that's been the case in 1992 with Ross Perot getting close to 20% of the vote, and then George Wallace in 1968 getting over 20% of the vote. So those are times of de-alignment. We'll just stay tuned for this election where you have an ongoing movement. It's a very interesting phenomenon, and I imagine many of you are paying attention to this, that you have an attempt to try to stop the front runner of a party's nomination, as we can see within the Republican ranks in Donald Trump right now. So will this create a significant third party and a movement away from the two-party system here in the presidential election of 2016? Now, this is a great book that deals with the concepts of voting and why people vote the way they do here in the United States. It came out in 1960, just a classic book. I'm sure we have a copy of it. I know we have a copy of it at the library. Angus Campbell's The American Voter. And within this, there's a description of different types of presidential elections. So there's three different types of elections I'd like for you to pay attention to here from this book, and some concepts here about what's the outcome of a particular presidential election. How do we identify the outcome? How do we measure it? How do we categorize it? So for example, most of the elections would be maintaining elections, that you'd have a presidential election would follow the patterns of the partisan structure of the country. How people identify with the parties is for the most part reflected in the way the breakdown of the outcome of the election would occur. So most people support one particular party, that's who they vote for, and that's how they win. There's been certainly some crossover that you can always expect, but one election is fairly typical of the past election. Occasionally you'll have what's called deviating elections, and the best example was when Dwight Eisenhower was elected in the 1950s, his elections in 1952 and 1956. Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican, was elected at a time in which the Democrats were clearly the dominant party. And so they had a much greater advantage over Republicans in party identification. They had a much greater advantage in the number of elected officials and party registration. And so even though they had large numbers in the state houses, they had large numbers in the House of Representatives in the U.S. Senate, they had large numbers in the number of elected governors, the president was a Republican. And so that's where we see how it fits into the concept of a deviating election. And this can happen when you have someone who's just very popular and causes people to cross over and vote for that candidate for the other party. And that was certainly the case for Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s. We can also surmise that this is fairly rare to have this type of situation when you have a lopsided partisan structure and yet you have a candidate from the other party winning. So let's focus now, though, on the concept of a realigning election. And we have 5 elections for us to really identify with here that you have one candidate that, as a result of that candidate's election success, it then means that there's a reversal in the partisan structure of the country. So first time that we can clearly identify this is in 1800, Thomas Jefferson, Democratic Republican, or Jeffersonian Republican, different descriptions there, defeating John Adams. And that party now becomes the dominant party. And so you can remember some of this from Chapter 9 in the structure of the partisan party systems. Then the realigning election of 1828, Andrew Jackson defeating the National Republican candidate and the incumbent president, John Quincy Adams, and ushers in a new party system. Then you have the division within the Democratic Party in 1860, and Abraham Lincoln, the first elected Republican president, wins, and this ushers in a new realignment and a new party structure in the country. Stephen Douglas is in the center there, and John Breckinridge on your right when you see that. I'm assuming everyone knows the picture of Abraham Lincoln there. Realigning election in 1896, where the Republicans, once again, there were some structure changes occurring in the country, different economic issues, different geographical issues, but and different issues regarding foreign policy. So there was some major issues that were developing within the country. McKinley, who's on the left here in this picture, wins and ushers in a new era of Republican Party dominance. And the last of our realigning elections, with Roosevelt winning in 1932, Roosevelt there on the left, Hoover on the right in these two pictures. And that ushers in a period of for the Democrats to have dominance after that election in 1932. Now, there's been some real questions about realignment. So I mentioned 5, and that means the last realignment, last presidential election that was a realignment, according to that chart, was 1932. So there comes questions to say, what about 1972? Nixon wins in a massive landslide, or Reagan winning in a very big landslide, and even a bigger landslide in 84. He first wins in 1980. Are those realignments? And perhaps they are, but we don't have one party, in this case Republicans. Both of those presidents were Republicans, but they don't win in the same level on down the ticket. In other words, in the House of Representatives and the Senate, and then in the state houses as well. But political scientist David Mayhew believes that we have too much emphasis on realignments anyway. And his argument would be that there's only been 2 realignments, 1860 and 1932. Those other ones are taken out of context, and that there's other presidential elections that are just as important that we just don't bring up. So I thought I would at least share that concept here. So in your notes, at least say 5 realignments, but 2 that are substantial above all the other ones, and that's in 1860 and 1932. Your book also goes into some discussion of recent presidential elections and midterm elections. And so let's spend some time thinking about that. The 2008 Democratic primary, for example, it was really interesting to look at the primary system versus the caucuses. And I just want to share that an interesting situation there on how candidates can react differently to the structure of an election. So in the primaries, Clinton outperformed Obama, but in 2008, in the caucuses, Obama outperformed Clinton. So this was an open seat. In this case, you had no incumbent president running for re-election. Democrats very competitive in seeking this this nomination. And so certainly as it started, there was a belief that Clinton would be able to win. And while she had greater success in the primaries, her success over Obama was not by that wide of a margin as compared to Obama's success in the caucuses to Clinton. It was a very extensive process, probably seeing something like that again this year, more so on the Republican side than the Democratic side, but perhaps even on the Democratic side, it may not be until June that we will know who the nominee would be for, in this case, the Democratic Party or certainly the Republican Party. So a very extensive process there in 2008. Early March, though, for the Republicans, it was wrapped up fairly quickly, certainly compared to what we're seeing right now. So John McCain won the nomination by early March. And so there were, starting off, quite a few people who were wanting to run in the Republican ranks, but winner-take-all primaries, as it was structured then, he wins early, he wins big early, knocks out the opposition, and so by certainly by the time 8 years ago, at the time that I'm recording this lecture now, we would have already known who the Republicans would have had as their nominee in 2008. And this is interesting here. Just spend some time. You might need to pause this and look this over. It's just something to share with what has been the process for the Republican Party throughout the last 40 or so years. In most instances, they have picked the person who lost the last time around in their primary process. So Reagan loses to Ford in '76, and then Reagan is the nominee in 1980. George Herbert Walker Bush loses to Reagan. Then he wins the nomination in 1988. Dole loses to Bush, and then he gets the nomination in 1996. Buchanan loses, and that's the one time it breaks, as you can see there. So in 2000, Buchanan's not the nominee. The pattern had worked that he would be. Then McCain loses to George W. Bush, and then you have a case where when it becomes open again for the Republicans, Romney loses to McCain. McCain, who had last lost when it was competitive, now he wins the nomination. And now Romney loses, and so then Romney wins. But now we know that Romney nor Santorum, the guy who lost to Romney, won't be the nominee. So it's once again a case where only twice, or actually 3 times during in the last 40 years has that pattern not been consistent. But so that's an interesting situation there for the Republican Party on how they normally go about picking their candidate for president. In the 2008 general election, one of the questions raised was why did they pick the vice presidential candidates they did? Why did the presidential candidates pick their vice presidential candidates? And so by most instances, most reviews here, the conclusion is Obama picked Joe Biden because of his success in believed success that he would be able to get for the ticket in Pennsylvania and Ohio, 2 key states in the presidential process. So he's from Delaware, that he would be able to win and help the party win, help Obama win in Pennsylvania and Ohio. McCain picked Sarah Palin to shake up his ticket. No one really knew about Sarah Palin. This is really completely out of the blue in a way that she was picked to be the vice presidential candidate. She had been governor for just a couple of years in Alaska and really was not on the radar screen for most people. So that was a very interesting pick, and it did get a lot of headlines and a lot of attention in the press for the McCain campaign. We can see here in the 2008 election, in blue for Obama. Obama wins in the Northeast. He wins on the West Coast. Does not really win many of the states in the South, although has some success there in Virginia, of course, in North Carolina and in Florida. Middle part of the country, that's McCain country, as we can see there in 2008. 2012, pretty much the same situation, although you have Obama losing in North Carolina and also in Indiana. You can see there in 2008, those are two states that he did win, lost those two states in the re-election. So there was a slight reduction in his electoral success. And again, read about the Electoral College here in this chapter, how you determine the electoral votes, and there's a good description there in your chapter about that. So again, Northeast, West Coast, just a part of Florida would be one state in the South really that has gone for the Democratic candidate fairly consistently, and that would be Florida, at least in the last couple of presidential elections. What's interesting is to look at 1896, which I mentioned as a realigning election. And so again, blue goes for the Democrat, red goes for the Republican. And notice there in the blue that those states that are now fairly consistent Republican are now, they were Democrat. And those states that were now fairly consistently Democrat were at that time Republican. West Coast, Northeast, Upper Midwest, those are all Republican areas in 1896. Southeast, middle part of the country, those were Democratic areas in 1896. So there's been a role reversal, at least geographically, in many cases for the parties from 1896 to now 2008 and 2012. One of the really interesting issues to consider here is the importance of Ohio. And I'll just share that with you here, that you can see strategically how important Ohio has been, especially for the Republican candidate. No Republican candidate has ever lost the state of Ohio and won the presidency. So it becomes extremely important to be able to win this state. And like so many different areas, it's really based upon the number of voters, not so much how much geographic area you control. So again, in the state of Ohio, the red representing a Republican candidate, blue a Democrat, and this is in 2012. And so we can see the Obama campaign focuses on key metropolitan areas of Ohio, oftentimes nicknamed the 3 C's. So you look at Cleveland in the north, Columbus in the middle, and Cincinnati in the south. And so if you control those areas, you win the state, even though if you lose a lot of other counties in that case. So here we can see some of the importance of being able to give money to campaigns and some of the changes in technology. And you can bet that 2016, both Republicans have stepped up their game on getting online contributions and getting other sources of campaign revenue, and Democrats are certainly continuing to focus on that. Your ability to succeed online becomes extremely important, not only for presidential elections, but increasingly for congressional elections and even for state elections in that case. So 13% gave to a presidential candidate. That's more than what we had listed when we talked about competing or participating in politics, Chapter 8. And we can see here people, of those people who gave, 67 donated in person, and then you had also individuals for telephone or by mail, but a good portion of them donated in person. You can see here then also donated online, and of those we can see the online contributions, a good portion of them, a larger portion of them were Democrats. And so that's probably an area that you can imagine the Republicans are starting to increase their emphasis in that area. Midterm elections. There's a good discussion in your text about midterm elections, 1860s. Since the 1860s, the President's Party has gained seats in Congress only 4 times. So this is oftentimes a case in which the president's going to lose legislative support in the midterm election. And that's been the case certainly for both midterm elections during the presidency of Barack Obama. But interesting here is that recently there were 2 presidents that actually were able to gain seats for their parties during midterm elections, and that was Bill Clinton in 1998 and George W. Bush in 2002. So they were able to do that. So there was some recent indication, an indication that in recent elections that there had been ways in which parties for the president could gain some seats. But that was not the case, as you'll read through here in your text, for the Democrats in the Obama presidency. In 2010, they lost a great deal of seats to the Republican Party. And through the Republican Party, one faction of the Republican Party, the Tea Party, was very intense, and they had a strong drive to consistently get out there and be active and to vote. And that was reflected in the outcome of the election. And that was the 2010 midterm election. And one of the big issues was what's referred to as the enthusiasm gap. So the enthusiasm for the Democrats was just not as great as it was for the Republicans. And as a result, more Republicans voted, and that helped to have greater success for the Republican Party. Democrats lost 63 seats in the House and 7 seats in the Senate in 2010. So it's pretty substantial. So remember the enthusiasm gap. Remember that going into the presidential election of 2016. Which party will have greater enthusiasm? Which party is more likely to support their candidate? And so it just added on to the success of the Republicans in the 2014 midterm election. They gained 9 seats in the Senate, and that's the most for a party since the 1980 election. And one-third of the Senate's up at any two-year time. So you're looking at 33 senators up for re-election or open seats for senators, and there was an advantage of 9 gained seats for the Senate, for the Republicans in the Senate. Pretty substantial. All 435 House districts are up every 2 years, and the Republicans continued to gain in that time in the 2014 midterm. Why do people vote the way they do? There can be lots of reasons. What we see here is the differences between looking to the future or looking in the past based on a record. And so we look at prospective versus retrospective voting. So 2008 was a very interesting election in that sense that you had Barack Obama, a young candidate for president who had a limited record during his time in elected office. He had been a senator for just a few years, and he had been in the state legislature for just a few years. Contrast that to Senator McCain, John McCain. He had been in politics since the 70s, going into the 2008 election. So are you basing your vote more on what you think the future will be like, or you're basing your vote more on what you believe is important from the past record of a candidate? So prospective, future, retrospective, the past. Retrospective can work if you like what the past has brought you. Retrospective won't work, as we can see, or is limited in its success if you're having really questions about what the past has brought to the present. And the same can be said there for the future, right? You're banking on hope for that future, that it will be beneficial then to vote for a particular candidate. Landmark court cases involving elections are voting participation, and you have to really always remember Citizens United case. Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission 2010. And the key part of this, corporations are like individuals, and you don't limit individual campaign contributions, so you can't then limit corporate campaign contributions. And that then means that campaign contributions from corporations can just explode in terms of the numbers and how much money they can in fact give, and who they give to and how they give to them. So there's lots of different ways now in which corporations can have a tremendous influence in our political campaigns. Certainly read about that, look at the ways in which corporations distribute money into our campaign system. There are still, of course, we've talked about this when we looked at political parties, there is a different way of determining the elections. Rather than single district simple plurality, you can go to proportional representation. Read about that on 389 in your text. And this does create, in most instances, a multi-member district system and allows each political party representation in proportion to its percentage of the vote. So if a party gets 30% of the vote, it's going to get 30% of the representation. If it gets 50% of the vote, it gets 50% of the representation. Some issues that are brought out here in your text, page 388, some of the things that we've already covered, so just once again kind of bring them up. Open primary generally means people who are not registered in a party can still vote in that party's primary. There can be some exceptions. Maybe they're roughly semi-open. A registered independent can do that. But purely open would mean people who are registered Republicans could vote in a Democrat primary and vice versa. Closed primary, only registered party members vote in the primary. Caucuses can operate the same way. They can be open or closed. And so a caucus is where people have to show up at a set time, must publicly announce the candidate that they are supporting. Read about that on 391. Straight ticket ballot, just like the name suggests, you vote for one party consistently down the ballot. Split ticket, you vote dividing up your ballot, and there's the pages that you can read about these things. Australian ballot, and I like to just give credit to our Aussie friends. They're the ones that created it. And so in other words, you get the ballot, you pull the curtain behind you, you mark off your ballot, no one knows how you voted. It's very important, I think, in our democratic system that that happens, that no one knows how you voted. You can come up with all kinds of elections in which people know how you voted. Ballots in different colors for the parties, for example. You have to raise your hand. You have to stand in a certain part of the room like we talked about with the caucus. But if you do those things, if there's intimidation associated with voting a certain way, then that really limits democratic participation. So we can see the importance there of the Australian ballot. Direct democracy, please read it about those on these particular pages here. 396, ballot initiative. This really is the basis of having petitions and a certain number of signatures. Put an issue on the ballot, people vote for it. Referendum, that's supporting what the legislature has already voted on, and the public now has to give their endorsement by supporting it or then failing to support it, and that vote then would be killed by what according to what the legislature had wanted. A recall is the way of removing an elected official. So certainly read about those issues and examples of direct democracy, the people having the power to make those decisions, found on those pages there, 396 and 397. A lot of issues here about the Electoral College. I'll just share those with you. Again, read the pages 394, 395. But do see here the number of electors is the number of representatives and senators in the state. We have 5 representatives, 2 senators, so we have 7 electors. They are not electors, the representatives or the senators. Electors usually vote for the candidate of their party. They don't have to, but they usually do. So you have a slate of electors. So Republican electors, if they get the chance to vote, they're going to be voting for the Republican candidate for president. And the Republican, almost always, it's based on voting collectively. So all 7 would get to cast their ballots in Oklahoma, and that's based on winner take all. The candidate that got the most of the popular vote would be able to cast a ballot. You need 270 electoral votes to be elected. And that's just breaking down the total electoral votes and the 3 votes added on from the District of Columbia. And if you can't get 270, then it goes to the House of Representatives. And the president's elected by the House, and then the vice president would be elected by the Senate. It's a very complicated issue, You break it down. I don't go into a whole lot of detail here, but you can read about it in your Constitution, and it's worth reading. Each state equates one vote to elect a president. So the state would have to figure out how they're going to determine their one vote. And that's the process. And if they can't come up with a decision there in the House, then the vice president elected by the Senate becomes the president, I suppose, or at least the acting president is vice president. So it's very complicated. It's only happened one time, 1824. So you get some idea there of there was an intent among those people writing the Constitution that this would be our normal process. And perhaps because of the complications and the responsibilities of the president, maybe it's best that we don't go this route, that we have a two-party system, and the Electoral College has been successful in most cases. Now, what we can pay attention to now going into the summer and fall of 2016 is if we have 3 or 4 substantial candidates on the ballot that can win a large percentage of the vote and outright win states and get electoral votes, then if no one gets 270, we will once again have that situation where the House will determine who will be president. Something to really pay attention to and stay tuned on, and hopefully you're finding some interest here about this process. It's a fascinating process, and this is a fascinating year, 2016. All right, we'll stop there. We'll move on then to Electoral College, excuse me. Next week we'll go over the interest groups on Chapter 11. So take care, and we'll be back next week.